Smoke billowed against the night sky, turning the moon into a pale, ghostly orb. Flames licked hungrily at the skeleton of the Grand Warehouse on East Harbor Street. Fire trucks formed a tight semicircle around the inferno, their sirens howling into the chaos. Firefighters moved like shadows against the flames, their movements urgent but precise. It was a battle, one they were fighting with everything they had. Daniel Hartwell stood at a safe distance from the scene, his hands buried in the pockets of his tailored coat. The bitter wind off the bay stung his face, but the real chill came from the memory of why he was there. He hadn't stepped foot in this part of the city in years, since before his billions had built the corporate empire that bore his name. But the fire had drawn him in. It was too close to home, too close to a past he'd tried to forget. "Mr. Hartwell?" A voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see his assistant, Amanda, her tablet glowing faintly in the darkness. Her usually composed demeanor was rattled, her expression tight. "They're saying everyone's been evacuated except for a firefighter still inside. He went back in to rescue someone who might still be trapped." Daniel's stomach tightened. He looked at the blazing structure, imagining the courage it took to charge into that inferno. "Did they get them out?" "They don't know yet." Amanda's voice wavered. Before Daniel could reply, a loud cheer erupted from the cluster of firefighters near the trucks. A figure emerged from the smoke, stumbling slightly but carrying a small child in their arms. The firefighter handed the child off to the paramedics before collapsing to their knees, exhausted but alive. The crowd clapped and whistled, relief palpable in the air. Daniel found himself moving toward the scene, drawn by something he couldn't explain. As the firefighter stood, he caught a glimpse of their face. Soot-streaked, sweat-drenched, but undeniably familiar. Daniel froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. The firefighter's helmet tilted back, revealing a sharp jawline and a pair of piercing gray eyes. The scar on the man's neck caught the light, long and jagged, running from his jaw to his collarbone. Daniel's breath caught. It was impossible. That scar. He'd seen it before. On his brother, Nicholas Hartwell. The name had been a ghost in Daniel's life for the past 15 years. Growing up in the same small-town chaos, the two brothers had been inseparable. Nick was the daredevil, always chasing adrenaline, jumping from cliffs into rivers, speeding down back roads on a beat-up motorcycle. Daniel was the planner, the responsible one who balanced Nick's recklessness with caution. But it had all shattered one freezing winter night. They had been driving back from a New Year's party when their car skidded on black ice and slammed into a tree. Daniel had crawled out of the wreckage, blood streaming from his forehead, to find Nick slumped in the passenger seat. His brother's neck had a jagged gash where shattered glass had sliced it, his face pale and lifeless. The paramedics had declared Nick dead at the scene. Daniel had buried him, mourned him, and spent years trying to live with the guilt. His brother's death had driven him to succeed. He built his empire as if by sheer will, he could make Nick's sacrifice mean something. But now, standing just feet away from the firefighter with the identical scar, Daniel's world tilted on its axis. Was this man Nick? Or was his grief playing tricks on him? The firefighter sat on the bumper of an ambulance, guzzling water and catching his breath. His hands were trembling, whether from exertion or adrenaline, Daniel couldn't tell. Summoning courage he didn't know he had, Daniel approached him. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice firmer than he felt. The man glanced up, his gray eyes sharp but guarded. "Yeah." Daniel hesitated, the words tangled in his throat. Finally, he gestured toward the scar. "That scar. How did you get it?" The man stiffened, his expression hardening. "What's it to you?" I think I know you," Daniel said. "Your name, is it Nicholas?" The firefighter's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. "No, my name's Alex, and I don't think we've met." Daniel stared at him, searching for a hint of recognition. But Alex, or Nicholas, looked back at him with nothing but confusion. "I had a brother," Daniel began, his voice thick. "He died in an accident 15 years ago." He pointed to the scar. You have the same scar he had. The same eyes. Are you sure you're not him? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Alex's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Daniel thought he saw something. Fear, guilt, or maybe pain. Flicker in the man's expression, but it was gone as quickly as it came. You've got the wrong guy, Alex said flatly, standing. Sorry about your brother, but I'm not him. Daniel's chest ached, the weight of the possibility crushing him. If I'm wrong, then tell me this. How did you get that scar? Alex froze, his hands clenching into fists. I don't owe you an explanation, he said coldly. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of firefighters. Amanda found Daniel minutes later, standing motionless as the fire trucks roared to life around him. Are you okay? She asked gently. No, Daniel said, his voice hollow. But I will be. He glanced at the warehouse, now reduced to smoldering ruins, and then at the spot where Alex had disappeared. His brother or not, Daniel wasn't letting this go. There were too many unanswered questions. Too many coincidences. Find everything you can on him, Daniel ordered Amanda. Alex, his background, his records, everything. Amanda nodded, concern etched across her face. What do you think you're going to find? Daniel turned to her, his eyes steely with determination. The truth. As they left the scene, Daniel felt a spark ignite deep within him. If Alex wasn't his brother, then who was he? And if he was Nicholas, why was he hiding? The answers lay ahead, and Daniel was prepared to tear down every wall to uncover them. The following morning, Daniel paced the sunlit expanse of his penthouse office, his mind a tangle of questions. The skyline of the city stretched beyond the glass walls, but he barely noticed it. The firefighter, Alex, and the scar, Nicholas's scar, occupied every corner of his thoughts. Amanda entered briskly, a folder in hand. I've got everything you asked for, she said, placing it on his desk. Daniel snatched it up, flipping through the pages. What did you find? Amanda hesitated. It's strange. Alex Porter has a clean record. Too clean. There's no trace of him before the age of 21. No high school transcripts, no childhood medical records. It's like he didn't exist before then. Daniel's brow furrowed as he scanned the documents. Alex's career as a firefighter was well documented, but everything before his early 20s was a void. What about family? He lists no next of kin, Amanda replied. I ran a deeper search and there's no birth certificate in his name. The closest match I found was an application for a social security number, issued around the same time he appeared in public records. Daniel slammed the folder shut, his chest tightening. That's not normal. People don't just appear out of nowhere. Amanda nodded. If he's hiding something, he's done a good job of it. Later that day, Daniel arrived unannounced at the fire station where Alex worked. The bustling energy of the station didn't deter him as he pushed through the double doors. His tailored suit and commanding presence immediately drew attention, but Daniel's focus was singular. Can I help you? A firefighter asked, stepping forward. I'm looking for Alex Porter, Daniel said. The firefighter frowned. He's not on shift today. Can I take a message? No, thanks. Daniel turned to leave, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. He was halfway to the exit when he spotted a bulletin board filled with photographs of the crew. Among them was Alex, standing with his team, smiling faintly. His hand rested on the shoulder of another firefighter, one Daniel recognized instantly. Michael Grant, Nick's best friend from their teenage years. The revelation hit Daniel like a lightning bolt. Michael and Nick had been inseparable, thick as thieves until Nick's death shattered their circle. And now Michael was here in the same firehouse as Alex? The coincidence was too great. Daniel tracked Michael down to a coffee shop near the station. He waited until the man stepped out. His frame bulkier than Daniel remembered, but his easy gait unmistakable. Michael paused when he saw Daniel, his brow furrowing in surprise. Daniel Hartwell? Michael asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "It's been a while," Daniel said, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, 15 years, Michael replied. "What are you doing here?" "I need to ask you something about one of your crewmates," Daniel said, skipping the pleasantries. "Alex Porter." Michael's face darkened. "Why are you asking about Alex?" Daniel took a step closer. "Because he has the same scar as Nick. The same scar, the same eyes. And I can't shake the feeling that—" "Stop," Michael interrupted, his voice firm. He glanced around, then gestured for Daniel to follow him around the corner. Out of earshot, he leaned against the brick wall, crossing his arms. "Alex isn't Nick," Michael said, his tone flat. "You're sure?" Daniel pressed. Michael hesitated, and for a moment, his confident exterior wavered. "I'm sure." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You're lying." Michael's jaw tightened. "What would you even do if he was?" "It's been 15 years, Daniel. Let it go. Let it go." Daniel snapped. "Nick was my brother. If there's even a chance he's alive, if Alex is him, I need to know." Michael exhaled sharply, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and guilt. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," Daniel demanded. Michael shook his head. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because it's not my story to tell," Michael said, his voice low. "If you want answers, you'll have to get them from Alex." Frustrated but undeterred, Daniel decided to press harder. That night, he returned to his office and instructed Amanda to pull more information. "Dig into Michael Grant," Daniel said. "I want to know how he ended up in the same firehouse as Alex." Amanda raised an eyebrow. "You think he's part of this?" "I think he knows more than he's letting on," Daniel replied. Over the next few hours, Amanda uncovered a trail that deepened the mystery. Michael had joined the firehouse 5 years earlier, around the same time Alex appeared in public records. Before that, Michael's whereabouts were murky, marked by odd gaps in employment and a brief stint in a small Montana town, one that also happened to be where Alex's social security application originated. "It's like they dropped off the grid together," Amanda said, her voice tinged with awe. "What do you think it means?" "It means they're hiding something," Daniel said, his resolve hardening. "And I'm going to find out what." The next day, Daniel didn't wait for Alex to show up at the firehouse. Instead, he found the man's address in Amanda's report and drove to the small, unassuming house on the outskirts of the city. Alex opened the door, his expression immediately hardening when he saw Daniel. "You again? What do you want?" "To talk," Daniel said. "No crowds, no interruptions. Just you and me." Alex hesitated, then stepped aside reluctantly. 5 minutes. The house was sparsely furnished but clean, with no personal touches to speak of. Daniel noticed the absence of family photos or keepsakes as he followed Alex to the kitchen. "I know you've been avoiding me," Daniel began. "And I get it, you don't owe me anything. But if you really aren't Nick, then just say so. Convince me." Alex leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "I already told you, I'm not your brother." "Then explain the scar," Daniel pressed. "Explain why Michael's here. Explain the gaps in your past. Because none of this adds up." Alex's eyes flashed with something, anger or maybe fear. "You're digging into things you don't understand." "Then help me understand," Daniel said, his voice softening. "If you're not Nick, prove it. And if you are, why are you hiding?" For a long moment, Alex didn't speak. The air between them grew thick with tension. Finally, he pushed off the counter, his expression unreadable. "Come back tomorrow," Alex said quietly. "I'll tell you everything." Daniel barely slept that night. The promise of answers had him pacing his penthouse, his mind spinning with possibilities. Was Alex really Nick? And if so, why would his brother have hidden for 15 years? The pieces didn't fit, but by morning, Daniel was more determined than ever to get to the truth. He arrived at Alex's house just after sunrise, the streets still quiet. Alex opened the door almost immediately, his face unreadable. "Come in," Alex said, stepping aside. Daniel followed him into the small living room, the air heavy with anticipation. Alex gestured to a chair and sat across from him, his hands clasped tightly. For a long moment, neither man spoke. "You wanted the truth," Alex said finally, his voice low. "So here it is." "I'm not Alex Porter," he began, his gray eyes locking onto Daniel's. "I'm Nicholas Hartwell, your brother." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Nick leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't die that night, but part of me wished I had." Daniel's mind reeled. "But the accident? The paramedics said you were gone." "They thought I was," Nick said, his voice bitter. "I was unconscious, bleeding out. When they pulled me out of the car, they assumed the worst. But on the way to the hospital, I started breathing again. Barely." Daniel's chest tightened. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't I know?" "Because I didn't want you to," Nick said, his voice sharp. "When I woke up in the hospital, they told me I'd need months of recovery, surgeries, and when I looked in the mirror, all I saw was a broken man. I couldn't face you like that. I couldn't face anyone." Daniel shook his head, disbelief washing over him. "So you just disappeared? For 15 years? Nick leaned back, his jaw tightening. "It wasn't that simple. After I recovered, I tried to rebuild my life. But everywhere I went, I saw reminders of what I'd lost. The life we had, the plans we made, they were gone. I couldn't go back to being your brother, Daniel. Not like that." Nick explained how he changed his name, moving from town to town, taking odd jobs to survive. He met Michael a few years after the accident, during a stint in Montana. "He recognized me immediately," Nick admitted. "I thought he'd tell you, but instead he stayed quiet. He said he'd respect my choice." "And the scar?" Daniel asked, his voice strained. Nick touched the jagged line on his neck, his expression dark. "A souvenir from that night. A constant reminder." Daniel stared at his brother, the pain of 15 years of silence clawing at his chest. "Do you have any idea what that did to me? Losing you? Blaming myself for your death." Nick's eyes softened. "I know, and I'm sorry. But at the time, I thought I was doing you a favor. You had your whole life ahead of you, Daniel. I didn't want to drag you down." "You didn't give me the chance to decide that," Daniel snapped, his voice rising. "You just disappeared and let me think you were dead." Nick's face twisted with regret. "I thought it would be easier for both of us. But I was wrong." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on both of them. Daniel felt a mix of anger, relief, and heartbreak swirling inside him. His brother was alive, sitting right in front of him, but the years they had lost could never be reclaimed. "So why now?" Daniel asked finally. "Why let me find you?" Nick hesitated, his hands tightening into fists. "Because I realized I couldn't keep running. Seeing you at the fire last night, it was like everything I'd buried came rushing back. The guilt, the memories. I couldn't hide anymore." Daniel leaned forward, his voice softening. "Then don't. Come back with me. Let's figure this out together." Nick's eyes darted away. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Daniel pressed. "Because I've made enemies," Nick admitted. "The life I've been living, it hasn't been clean. There are people who would use me to get to you, to your company. If I come back, I put you at risk." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I don't care about the risk. I care about you." Before Nick could respond, a loud crash shattered the quiet. Both men jumped to their feet as the living room window exploded inward, shards of glass scattering across the floor. "What the?" Daniel started, but Nick grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the back door. "They found me," Nick said, his voice grim. "Who?" Daniel demanded as they sprinted into the backyard. "No time to explain," Nick said, his tone urgent. "Just keep moving." They darted into the narrow alley behind the house, the sound of footsteps and shouting growing louder behind them. Nick led the way, his movements quick and sure, as if he had rehearsed this escape route 100 times. "Nick!" Daniel shouted, What's going on? I told you, I made enemies, Nick replied, glancing over his shoulder. And now they're here. The alley opened onto a busy street, the noise of traffic masking the sound of their pursuers. Nick pulled Daniel into the shadows of a parking garage, pressing a finger to his lips for silence. Seconds later, two men in dark suits appeared, scanning the street. One of them spoke into a radio, his voice low and sharp. After a tense moment, they moved on. Nick exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief. We need to split up. Like hell we do, Daniel shot back. You're not disappearing on me again. Nick's expression hardened. If you stay with me, you'll get hurt. I'm not letting that happen. I don't care, Daniel said fiercely. You're my brother. We're in this together. Nick hesitated, his gray eyes searching Daniel's face. Finally, he nodded. Okay, but if we're going to do this, we need a plan. The hum of fluorescent lights in a small, nondescript motel room was the only sound as Nick secured the door's lock. Daniel sat on the edge of the creaky bed, his heart still racing from the chase. He'd come looking for answers and instead found himself plunged into a world of danger he couldn't have anticipated. Nick turned from the door, his face hard but calm. They'll keep looking, he said. We've bought some time, but not much. Daniel clenched his fists. You need to start explaining. Who were those men? Why are they after you? Nick exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. They work for a man named Victor Dane. He's a criminal, arms deals, smuggling, money laundering, you name it. I worked for him years ago. You what? Daniel's voice rose in disbelief. It wasn't by choice, Nick said sharply. I was broke, trying to survive after the accident. Victor found me, offered me a job. At first, it was small stuff, transporting packages, no questions asked. But the deeper I got, the harder it was to get out. Daniel shook his head, trying to process the revelation. You've been working for a criminal all this time? Not anymore, Nick said firmly. I walked away 3 years ago, or tried to, but Victor doesn't let people go easily. He's been hunting me ever since. Nick sat down, his expression softening. I didn't plan for any of this, Daniel. When I left you, I thought I was doing the right thing. But it led me into something worse. Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to be angry, to shout at his brother for the years of silence, for the lies. But the exhaustion in Nick's eyes tempered his anger. He saw the same fearless older brother who had once protected him from school bullies, now worn down by guilt and hardship. Why didn't you come to me for help? Daniel asked quietly. Nick gave a bitter laugh. You were building an empire, Daniel. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I'm alive, but I've been working for a crime lord? I couldn't drag you into that. And yet here we are, Daniel said, his voice tinged with irony. Nick smiled faintly. Yeah, here we are. The conversation shifted to the present. Daniel pressed Nick for details about Victor Dane, trying to piece together the danger they faced. Victor's empire is collapsing, Nick explained. Law enforcement is closing in, and he's desperate. He thinks I have information that could either save him or incriminate him. Do you? Daniel asked. Nick hesitated, his jaw tightening. I might, but even if I don't, Victor's convinced I do. That's all that matters. Daniel frowned. So he's chasing you for something you may not even have? Nick nodded grimly. Exactly. The absurdity of it all hit Daniel like a wave. His long-lost brother had reappeared, only to drag him into a life-or-death struggle against a crime syndicate. And yet, despite the danger, Daniel couldn't walk away. Not again. We need a plan, Daniel said finally. You said it yourself, we can't keep running. Nick arched an eyebrow. You have something in mind? I built a billion-dollar company from scratch, Daniel said. I know how to take down powerful men. We don't have to fight Victor. We just have to make him think we're more dangerous than he is. The brothers spent the next several hours devising a strategy. Nick provided details about Victor's operations, his known associates, the locations of safe houses, and a few key weaknesses. Daniel, in turn, used his resources to track down information Amanda had dug up on Victor. It's all leverage, Daniel explained. Victor thrives on fear. We just need to make him believe we're holding the bigger stick. Nick's expression was skeptical. And if he calls our bluff? Daniel met his gaze. Then we hit him with everything we've got. By the time the plan was set, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. The brothers shared a tense silence, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. You've changed, Nick said quietly, breaking the silence. Daniel glanced at him. What do you mean? Nick smiled faintly. You used to be cautious, always playing it safe. Now you're talking about taking on a crime lord like it's just another day at the office. Daniel shrugged. Losing you taught me that playing it safe doesn't always protect what matters. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. Nick nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. Let's hope you're right. Before they could execute their plan, the motel room phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. Daniel and Nick exchanged a tense look before Nick picked it up. Hello, a chillingly familiar voice answered. Hello, Nick. Nick's hand tightened around the receiver. Victor. Daniel stood, his body tense as he watched his brother's face. I see you've reunited with your brother, Victor continued, his tone smug. Heartwarming, really? But I'm afraid the reunion will be short-lived. What do you want? Nick growled. I want what you took from me, Victor said. And if I don't get it, I'll take something of yours instead. Your choice. The line went dead. Nick slammed the phone down, his jaw clenched. He knows where we are. Daniel grabbed his phone. We need to move. Now. The brothers hurriedly packed their things and slipped out the back of the motel, keeping to the shadows. They didn't have a clear destination, only the knowledge that staying put was no longer an option. We need to go on the offensive, Daniel said as they climbed into Nick's truck. Victor's coming for us, whether we run or fight. Let's make it the latter. Nick glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You're a lot more reckless than I remember. Desperate times, Daniel replied. You in. Nick grinned. Always. As the truck sped down the dark highway, Daniel's mind raced with the weight of what lay ahead. They were taking a gamble, one that could either save them or destroy them. But for the first time in years, he and Nick were fighting side by side. And they weren't going down without a fight. The dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of the city was quiet, its towering walls casting long shadows in the moonlight. Inside, Daniel and Nick stood in the center of the cavernous space, their plans set and their nerves steeled. They had chosen this location for its isolation, but also for its symbolism. An empty place where they could finally face their past and their enemy. It'll work, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. We've covered every angle. Nick adjusted his jacket, his movements sharp with tension. Victor doesn't play by the rules. We're walking into a fight with a man who has nothing to lose. Neither do we, Daniel replied, his eyes locked on his brother's. The words hung in the air like a solemn vow. They didn't have long to wait. The faint hum of car engines approached, and soon the warehouse was flooded with the glare of headlights. 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop, their doors opening in unison as Victor Dane stepped out, flanked by his men. Victor's gaze swept the room, landing on the 2 brothers. His smirk was slow and calculating. You've been busy, Nick. Nick's fists clenched at his sides, but Daniel stepped forward, his posture commanding. You want something from him. Let's hear it. Victor chuckled, his voice smooth and dangerous. Straight to business. I like that. He gestured to his men, who remained at his sides like shadows. Nick has something of mine, information that could ruin me. I want it back. Nick stepped up beside Daniel, his voice low and firm. I don't have it, Victor. Victor's expression darkened. You expect me to believe that? I don't care what you believe, Nick shot back. You've been chasing a ghost. Victor's smirk faded entirely, replaced by a cold fury. Then you're of no use to me. But your brother. His gaze shifted to Daniel, a predator eyeing new prey. You've been quite the thorn in my side these last few days. Daniel held his ground, his voice cutting. You don't scare me. Victor's laugh was chilling. You should be. I don't lose. Before Victor could say more, the hum of additional engines filled the air. From the shadows, a line of black SUVs appeared, but these vehicles bore a different emblem: law enforcement. Victor's men tensed, their hands moving to their weapons. Nick grinned, his confidence returning. Oh, you lose, Victor. You just don't know it yet. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but laced with triumph. We've been tracking your movements for days. Every call, every meeting, every shipment. It's all documented. And now, the people you've been avoiding are here to collect. Victor's eyes narrowed, his smirk gone. You're bluffing. Try me, Daniel said, pulling a small device from his pocket. He pressed a button, and the faint sound of voices filled the warehouse. Recordings of Victor's conversations, outlining his criminal empire in damning detail. The sight of the device and the implications of its contents was enough to shake even Victor. His men shifted uneasily, their confidence wavering. You've got nothing, Victor hissed. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Tell that to the agents waiting outside. Chaos erupted as federal agents poured into the warehouse, their weapons drawn and voices shouting commands. Victor's men hesitated, unsure whether to fight or flee, but Victor himself remained still, his sharp gaze locked on the brothers. This isn't over, Victor growled, his voice low and venomous. For you it is, Nick said, stepping closer. I'm done running, Victor, and you're done chasing me. Victor's smirk returned, colder than before. You think this changes anything? There's always someone waiting to take my place. Then we'll deal with them, Daniel said firmly. Just like we dealt with you. As agents surrounded Victor and his men, Nick and Daniel stepped back, their mission complete. Victor was escorted away, his glare promising revenge that would never come. The quiet after the chaos was deafening. Nick and Daniel stood outside the warehouse, the cool night air wrapping around them. For the first time in years, there was no danger lurking in the shadows. I didn't think it was possible, Nick admitted, his voice soft, to finally stop running. Daniel smiled faintly. That's what family's for. Nick glanced at him, his expression serious. I owe you, Daniel, for everything. You don't owe me anything, Daniel said. Just don't disappear again. Nick's smirk returned, a hint of the brother Daniel remembered from their youth. Deal. The weeks that followed were a blur of debriefings and adjustments. Nick worked with law enforcement to tie up loose ends from Victor's empire, while Daniel returned to his company, though with a newfound focus on family over fortune. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Daniel's penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle below, Nick broke the silence. So, what now? Daniel shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. Now we live. No more running. No more secrets. Nick raised his glass. To the Hartwell brothers. Together again. Daniel clinked his glass against Nick's. To family. As they sat under the stars, the weight of the past lifted, replaced by a future they were ready to face. Together.